Thank you, Father, so much for the day and for the blessings you give us. We're here to study your word. Open our hearts and our minds to your truths. Help us to grow and be what we need to be. Father, I'm thankful for every student online. I pray that you'd please be with each and every one of them and the burdens and the struggles they're facing. I'm thankful, Lord, for the ones that's here. We're grateful, Father, for your passionate love for us. We are grateful for your care and concern. And we humbly ask that you strengthen us and bless us and be with me tonight to help me to do the very best job I can to explain these things that are even hard for me to grasp and understand because, Lord, we didn't live in those situations. We didn't live seeing these things actually take place. We're amazed that you give us a law. We are amazed that you want a relationship with us. We are amazed that you love us the way you do. Help us, Lord. I ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to start tonight in chapter 20. Some of the things that we also know and really as we're looking at Leviticus is that, and we've already seen this, and we're going to see it again tonight, this idea of repetition. Part of the reason why he repeats a lot of these things is because he wants to emphasize the importance of them. Whenever a teacher does that, what is the teacher trying to do? I want you to get this. You may not get the rest of it, but I definitely want you to get this. So when we come to chapter 20, he's going to talk about some of the very same things he's talked about before, but you're also going to see references back to the 10 Commandments all through here. In chapter 20, he said, you shall say to the children of Israel, whoever of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell in Israel. And one of the last things we pointed out last week is that if a stranger dwells in your land, chapter 19 verse 33, you shall not mistreat him. You treat him as one born among you. You shall love him as yourself. Remember 19:18 says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He says, you shall do no injustice in judgment, measurement, and length, weight, or volume. You shall have honest scales. He says, you shall observe all my statutes. I am the Lord. So he says, now, whenever you or any of the strangers who dwell in Israel gives any of his descendants to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. Now, we've already seen this idea before in the 18th chapter. And so we know exactly what he's talking about there in the fact of causing that child to be burned to death in that idol. Remember that? All righty. And he says, I shall set my face against that man, cut him off from his people, because he's given some of his descendants to Molech to defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name. What is the word Leviticus all about? It's all about God's holiness, and he wants a holy people. He said, if they hide their eyes from the man, and he gives some of his descendants to Molech, and they do not kill him, I will set my face against that man, against his family. I will cut him off from his people, and all those who prostitute themselves with him to commit harlotry with Molech. Now, later we're going to see during the time of the kings, some of the kings actually do this. They actually offer their own children to this god. Whoever turns to mediums and familiar spirits, we talked about that last week, that idea there. To prostitute, I'll set my face against him. What's he doing? He's reminding them again that this is who I am. It goes back to the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. So always be holy, consecrate yourselves, set yourselves apart, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and perform them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You curse mother or father, what's his condemnation? Death. Honor thy father and mother. So if you curse father and mother, death. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, death. The man who lies with his father's wife, both of them shall surely be put to death. Man lies with his daughter-in-law. We've already read this in chapter 18. What's he saying? I am the Lord. This is the penalty. This is what has to happen. A man lies with a male as he lies with a woman. Both of them have committed an abomination. Their blood shall be upon them. Now, notice it's not upon the people. It's upon them. It's because of their sins. And again, that principle is found all the way through Scripture. We have to pay for our own sins. We have to bear our own sins. But thankfully, Jesus bore our sins. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it's wickedness. They shall be burned with fire. He and they, that there will be no wickedness among you. Now, there's a lot of question. If you have them being put to death in a lot of these situations, a lot of times being put to death would be by what? Stoning. But then you will also read in Leviticus where sometimes they will be burned. Okay? And it seems to suggest, as we look through this context, it seems to suggest that perhaps they first were stoned, and then rather than given a burial, they would be go ahead and burned. Okay? And maybe this again is where we have the idea of why we struggle so much with the idea of cremation versus burial. And some people have some ideas about that. You read some of this stuff on the internet. Is it wrong for a Christian to be cremated? Is it wrong for, or, should they be buried? And you can find some good discussions about that in a lot of situations. Sharing with you my opinion, did you hear that? That's right, I want to emphasize that, is the fact that the God who made us out of dust, whenever we die, we're going to go back to dust. God can, do the same thing with cremation. Suppose you die in a fiery crash and you're a Christian, and you die in a fiery crash and they're just literally, sadly, collecting your bones and fragments from that crash. Does that mean you're going to be lost because of that situation? No. But what he's saying here is by burning them with fire, emphasizes how God is wanting them to be punished, and more than that, how their body's going to be desecrated because of this sin. Okay? And I think from that Old Testament context, we have to keep that in our mind. He talks about verse 15, if a man mates with an animal, you shall put the man and the animal to death. If a woman does the same thing, if a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, and it's a wicked thing, they shall be cut off. Notice the word cut off. And again, what does that mean there? It suggests the idea of, again, being put to death, made bare. That's the suggestion there. So he just adding different words here to suggest that. Man lies with a woman during her sickness and uncovers her nakedness, both of them shall be cut off. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, father's sister, uncle's wife, brother's wife. We studied all this back in Leviticus. Why is he repeating them again? Emphasis. They are important. If God looked at that way in the Old Testament, we understand in Matthew chapter 5 where he says, whoever looks at a woman to lust after her has committed adultery. So you see, Jesus is trying to deal with the heart of the matter. God here in the Old Testament is dealing with the actual matter. And here's the point. Verse 22, you shall therefore keep all my statutes, my judgments, that the land where I'm bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. And I've shared before, we've looked at this passage and this idea before, Leviticus chapter 18 and 19, verse 37. And the idea there is that the reason why the Canaanites would be cast out was because of these very same sins. The point that's applicable to us today is God's people are holy. And God's people need to live a different life than the rest of the world. And so we need to make sure that we're not doing this and engaging in this stuff. Well, everybody else, how many times you're a Christian say everybody else is doing it? That doesn't matter. You can't. You're a Christian. You're called to a different life. All righty? He says, I have said to you, let's see. He says, you shall not walk in the statutes of the nation in which I'm casting you out, for they commit these things, and I abhor them. And you shall inherit their land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord who has separated you from the people. You shall distinguish clean and unclean, clean and unclean birds, clean and unclean animals. And you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated from you. And so again, he's verse 27, we've heard this before. Whoever has a familiar spirit shall be put to death. Chapter 21 is mainly dealing with the conduct of the priests. This is a book of laws for the priests. All right, here's how the people ought to be. Now, what about the priests? They're the leaders. They're the ones that should be setting the example. And so again, he's emphasizing the idea. Here's some things that they need to understand. No priest shall defile himself for the dead among his people, except for his relatives, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, his virgin sister. Otherwise he shall not defile himself, because he is a chief man, a master among the people to profane himself. They shall not make any bald place on their head. And again, usually, as I shared with you before, a lot of times when they were showing that, they would cut their head, cut their hair. you know, things along that line. He says, they shall be holy. Why the priests? They have to honor God. They have to set the example. They have to offer these sacrifices. And if they're not holy, then those sacrifices will not be holy, and the people will not be holy. The priest cannot take a wife who's a harlot, for the priest is holy to his God. He says, you shall consecrate him. And notice again the emphasis upon consecrate, holiness. It's God who sanctifies you. All of these things in there, coming in there. What about a woman, the daughter of any priest? If she profanes herself by playing the harlot, she profanes her father. So we get to the idea that we all have to bear our own sins, and there's truth to that. But here in this situation, he's emphasizing the idea that obviously daddy's not doing what he needs to be doing. And this is, I think, something very important to discuss with preachers and teachers in the church today. Take care of your own family first. Deal with your family first. Make sure your family is going to go to heaven. Make sure you're doing what you're supposed to do for your family. And then try to teach others as well. Because again, if your family's not doing what they're going to do or what they need to do, then what? You know, so I'm out there trying to teach the gospel, and somebody says, well, what about your family? Are they all faithful? And sometimes, you know, of course, they're grown up. Whenever I was there, when they were home, they could live their lives the way, or after they left, they could live their lives the way they want to. But still, even whenever you're older, the family has an impact upon the people, upon the preacher, upon the elders. You know, we get into the discussions, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but we get into the discussions in the Lord's church about elders. We know that 1 Timothy 3 says that he must rule well his own house. And he must have children that are believers, right? Well, that obviously suggests the fact that he's brought them up to the point to where they could become Christians. What if these elders have children that after they leave home no longer are faithful to the Lord? Are they faithful now to become elder? Are they qualified to be an elder? There's a lot of discussion about that. There's a lot of discussion. In the way the world is today, sometimes our kids being taught all of these erroneous things in school, they go out and live a different kind of life. They turn their back on God. Can an elder be held accountable for that after they've left the house? Thoughts, questions, ideas? Have any of you struggled with that one a little bit? Suppose you had two or three, the elders have two or three sons or two or three daughters. Two of them are faithful, one of them's not. What about in that situation? Can he, in that situation, still serve as an elder? Again, when they're at home, when he's still in control of them, that's one thing. What about when they get out on their own? You know, we really sit down and discuss these things sometimes. And so it's, they don't. They really don't. And because again, here's part of the problem. We don't know exactly how they were brought up in every situation. Sometimes parents get tired. And after you have one or two, then the third one's kind of like, just whatever, go do what you know. You get tired, and it shouldn't be that way, right? But it happens, right? And the sad tragedy of it is it breaks our hearts. Notice again here, he's laying down a principle that I think could have application to leaders in the church today. Something to think about. All righty? Let's go a little further. By the way, if she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. All righty? And again, this was probably after stoning. He who is a high priest among his brethren, on whose head the anointing oil was poured, shall not uncover his head nor tear his clothes. This would happen a lot of times, showing what? Showing sorrow over sin, showing weeping over the loss of somebody. So again, he shall not go near any dead body, nor defile himself for his father or his mother. Now you notice earlier that they cannot defile themselves, but the high priest, he can't even go to mama or daddy's funeral. He couldn't even go to his sister's funeral. That's what he's saying here. Why? Because if he's got the anointing oil on his head, he cannot even go, he cannot defile himself for his father or his mother. He cannot go out of the sanctuary. He cannot profane the sanctuary, for the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is upon him. And I am the Lord. So while the priests could go to their parents, the high priest couldn't. Think about that. All right, he would have to mourn by himself. Why? Because again, he's standing there before God, and if he had come into contact with a dead body, that would have defiled him. Remember? So that's the reason why the high priest could not do that. This priest had to take a wife in her virginity. He could not take a widow or a divorced woman or a defiled woman or a harlot. And I think part of this is, and if you're reading Coy Roper's on Leviticus, he emphasized the idea that the reason why in this situation is the purity of the high priesthood and the lineage coming down through there. So these children had to be in such a way to where there's not going to be any question about whether or not this child is a descendant of the high priest and can serve as the high priest. I think that's why this particular law is there. All righty. Yeah.
Some of these people who write on the subject of divorce make the subject about is marriage holy or is marriage not holy?
Mm-hmm.
Some will say, marriage is a suspension in the Bible, but being mentioned in the Bible does not make it holy. That marriage is something that governments pronounce. They join people together, they minister over them. Because some people will say, no, the governments have no authority. So that if the government divorces a couple, then God doesn't recognize that, because God is the one that recognizes whether divorce is taking place. And when they say they're holy here, that kind of says God does have a role in the marriage.
Yeah.
And that when people say marriages are made in heaven, they're not really made in the courts,
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about all that discussion?
I think Genesis 1 forever answers that question, where he emphasizes the idea first he created man, then he created woman, and God was there, and he's the one that brought them together. And Jesus will quote that in Matthew chapter 19, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And so it doesn't matter what the laws of the land say. If God has brought them together, then they should not be put asunder. So the question is, how does God bring them together? Well, how did he bring Adam and Eve together? We sit and think a lot of times about our marriages and so forth, and we struggle with things that go on in our marriages. We all have problems in our marriages because we're living in a broken world. We have problems in churches. We have problems in government. All the problems are because we're in a broken world. But Christians should look at this from the viewpoint, I want a Christian mate. I want somebody that's going to be with me and have that commitment. There are times when my wife has been very angry with me, but we never talk about divorce. We work it out. And that's the way I think it should be. And so many times in a lot of situations, this doesn't happen. And again, Jesus gave the only real reason. Now, Deuteronomy, when we get there in Deuteronomy chapter 24, Moses is going to write a law saying for any reason. Moses writes the law saying if there's any uncleanness in her. And then like every other book of the Bible, people try to interpret it the way they want to make uncleanness mean something other than what God intended. And Jesus will make it as clear as day in Matthew 19, except for fornication, period. So now I know what the uncleanness is. Now we have the very Son of God telling me what the uncleanness of Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 is. So in that situation, And then he says what? What God has joined together, let not man put asunder. I do not agree. I understand what they're trying to do in that, because by doing that, they're minimizing marriage. They're saying that divorce is not an issue. And they're also saying that marriage is just something man has come up with. But I think everything the Bible teaches tells us something totally different.
Yeah, what I've heard some people say is when he says, let not man put asunder, that doesn't mean it cannot be done. Man can do it, but God doesn't want it to happen. There's a difference between, I don't recognize this divorce because I'm saying let it not occur, from saying, oh, it happened. I see that it happened. Some of these people did it. I recognize it occurred, but I don't approve of it. It wasn't my intention this happened. It's like a slight difference in distinction from, in my eyes, it never happened. And you're always joined to the original spouse, no matter what you do later in your life, because I say it can't happen. And I say, no, let it not happen is saying, recognize it can happen, but it's a sin because I'm telling you, don't do it.
Yeah. And to me, that's exactly what Jesus said. Let not man put asunder. Period. And who is Jesus? He's the Son of God. Did he have the right to speak on this? Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. So that solved the issue as far as I can see. And so the problem is, again, is there's so many folks that are dealing with these issues in the church. And that's where the struggles are. That's where the struggles are.
So when we read here, we talk about being holy. Holy implies God's right in the middle of those marriages.
That's exactly right. And especially here in this situation with the high priest. But as we've seen through this entire book, it's not just the priest. He says what? I sanctify these people. I sanctify the priesthood. I'm the one that made you holy. So if he does that, then does that not also emphasize the idea that what? That marriage is holy. God's in the middle of it. Good question. All righty. As I said, 14 and 15 tells us the reason why he shall not marry any of these women, nor shall he profane his posterity among the people. And then he says, we're going on to number 16, no man of your descendants who has any defect may approach to offer the bread of God. Any man who has a defect, a man blind, lame, marred face, a limb too long, I'm not sure exactly, one arm longer than the other, 1 foot long, or leg longer than the other. A man who has a broken foot, a broken hand, a hunchback, a dwarf, a man who has a defect in his eye, eczema, scabs, or as a eunuch. Any man who has a defect shall not come near. No man shall come near to offer the offerings made by God. And again, he may eat the bread of his God, both the holy and the most holy. But he shall not go near the veil or approach the altar because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuaries. And Moses told it to Aaron and his sons and to all the children of Israel. So everybody's buying into this, okay? And this again is the regulation for the conduct of the priest. Now, again, chapter 22, verse 1, you have the same idea. Then the Lord spoke to Moses. So again, here you have the Lord giving this. Speak to Aaron and his sons that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel. They may not profane my holy name by what they dedicate to me. I am the Lord. The word for separate there in verse 2 is Nazar. And that word is where you get the word Nazarite. And we're going to read later about the Nazarite vows, where men would take a situation to separate themselves for a period of time so that they might be in a closer relationship with God. So this word separate themselves is where we get the word Nazarite. All righty? So he says, throughout all your generation, whoever goes near the holy things, while he has some uncleanness from him, that person shall be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord. Whatever man of the descendants of Aaron who is a leper, a discharge, shall not eat the holy offering until he's clean. Whoever touches anything made unclean by a corpse, or if a man has an emission of semen, whoever touches any creeping thing that he would make him unclean, he said that person shall be unclean until evening. He shall not eat the holy offerings unless he washes his body. So this is a continuation of these things. He said, when the sun goes down, he shall be clean. Then he may eat the holy offerings, because it is his food. Whatever dies naturally is torn by beast, shall not eat. I am the Lord. Keep the ordinance, lest they bear sin and die therefore. If they profane it, I, the Lord, sanctify them. Okay? No outsider shall eat the holy offering. One who dwells with a priest, and this would be as a visitor. So suppose some priest comes or he's serving, and there comes a visitor, and he's staying a little bit with the priest. That visitor cannot eat this holy food. He cannot eat anything of this, because again, that is for the priest. Notice, if the priest buys a person with his money, he may eat it. Now, this is slavery. Slavery, as I mentioned before, was very common at that time. Okay? And so whoever's born in his house. But if the priest's daughter is married to an outsider, that's not a part of the family, she may not eat of the holy offerings. If the priest's daughter is widowed or divorced, has no child, has returned to her father's house, she may eat her father's food. But see, she's now widowed or divorced. Now notice there's that word divorced first time there. And like I said, we'll key in on that again when we get to Deuteronomy 24. If a man eats the holy offering unintentionally, he shall restore a holy offering and add 1/5 to it. All righty? Notice the word unintentionally. He eats it unintentionally. It's not something he purposed to do. You shall not profane the holy offerings of the children of Israel, or allow them to bear the guilt of trespass when they eat their trespass offerings, for I, the Lord, sanctify them. All righty? Now, here it goes back over some of these offerings again that are accepted or not. Speak to Aaron and to all the children of Israel. Now, not till chapter 20, verse 1 through 22, verse here, he's been talking to Aaron's family. Now he says, to all the children of Israel, whatever man who offers the sacrifice of his vows, the votive offerings, as we talked about, or any of his free will offerings, they shall offer as a burnt offering. You shall offer a free will, a male without blemish from the cattle, from the sheep, or from the goats. Kind of sounds like we're going over this again. Yeah? Why does God repeat himself? Why do parents have to repeat themselves? Why do on and on and on it goes, right? Whoever offers a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord to fulfill the vow, you cannot offer what? A blind, broken, maimed, eczema, scabs. You shall not offer God something that is not what? Perfect, as it was. Either a bull or a lamb that has any limb too long or too short. You shall not offer to the Lord that which is bruised or crushed or torn or cut. Nor from a foreigner's hand shall you offer any of these things, because their corruption is in them. They shall not be accepted. He says, when a bull or sheep or a goat is born, it shall have 7 days with its mother, and then it shall be able to be sacrificed. 7 days and then sacrificed. When you offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, offer it of your own free will. On the same day it shall be eaten. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. Now, we actually tie chapter 18 through chapter 22 together, and now he's coming to the conclusion of it. Chapter 18 through 22 is together here, and now 31 through 33, verse 31 through 33 is actually the conclusion. You shall keep my commandments and perform them. Why? I am the Lord. That is all that's necessary. You shall do what I tell you to do. Why? Why, Lord? I'm the Lord. I'm the Lord. That's it. That's the answer right there. Right? And so that's so important. You shall not profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. Why? I am the Lord. I'm it. His holiness. And he wants you. He said, I am the Lord who sanctifies you. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I delivered you from slavery. And I brought you up to be your God. I am the Lord. Yes.
What do you think it means to profane the name of the Lord? Profane my holy name.
Well, again, to desecrate it, to deny it, what is a name? What do we use a name for? It identifies somebody. You're Carrie. All right? Your parents named you that, and you've been called that all your life. That identifies who you are. When God is speaking here, I am the Lord. I am Yahweh. That name identifies who he is. So by profaning the name is saying is by denying that he is not God, or by denying one of his attributes, or as the law has been up through this point in time, saying it doesn't matter what he says, I'll do what I want to do. So profaning the name could be, yes, cursing his name. And later, as we get into this, we're actually going to see it, especially in the book of Leviticus a little bit later on here. Let me see if I can see it real quick. Go to chapter 24, verse 10. Leviticus number 24, verse 10. The son of an Israelite woman whose father was an Egyptian went out among the children of Israel, and this Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought with each other. And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Dibri. So they put him in custody that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. Now you remember, one of the 10 commandments, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in. This got into a fight, and he cursed God's name, or used God's name in a profane way. So what's about to happen to him? We know the rest of the story. But when I get there, let me go ahead and look at this very quickly. Here's a situation where you have a case law. You have the laws written down. All right. If you're an attorney, as I've said before, you've got the laws of the state of Georgia that takes an entire library. All righty. And you've got to find case laws where a particular law fits a particular situation. God has, up to this point in time, been giving them laws after laws after laws, especially in Leviticus. Now, they actually have a situation where a man has cursed the name of God. What do you do now? What's going to be the punishment? Here's the case law. It's not a situation where it's just on the books. Now somebody's actually done it. What are we supposed to do now? And that's exactly what's going on. And you're going to see the same thing going on in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, 32 through 36, where another example of a case law is going to come up. So God is going to tell him, this is what you do. You take him outside the camp. Let all those who hurt him lay their hands on his head. And what are they doing? They're witnesses. What is a witness supposed to do? He's supposed to testify to what that person did or said. Okay? And by putting their hands on his head, we heard him say this. We saw the fight. We heard him say this. And we knew that something was not right. And so we brought him to Moses. He said, you lay the hands on him. Again, we remember earlier that a lot of times they would be laying the hands on these goats or these other animals to put their sins on him, right? So here these witnesses are saying the same thing. Whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All righty? And all the and notice who all gets involved in this. All the congregation. What does that say to us today? I'm jumped ahead a little bit, but what does that say to us today? Saying, well, this is just my sin and I've got to be the one. No. The way God looked at it back at that time, the whole congregation had to buy into the punishment. When the whole congregation buys into the punishment, it reminds them, and it also is a very big warning to them that what? I was there when that man was stoned to death. I don't want to do that. That's what the purpose of it is. So here he comes, and he's going to go on here. Notice, and I've skipped this, but we'll skip it in just a moment. He said, whoever kills any man shall surely be put to death. So what happens here is you have a situation where this man had broken God's law, Exodus 20, verse 7. You have the case of what should be done to him, and they did that. And then now you had it. Okay, here's what happens. Whoever kills any man shall surely be put to death. Here's the death penalty. Whoever kills an animal shall make it good, animal for animal. If you cause disfigurement to your neighbor, whatever's been done to you will be done to you. So if you broke his jaw, your jaw is going to be broken. Well, that'll make me think twice before I do that again. You know what I'm saying? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. Supposedly, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's just punishment. What is this about? It's about vengeance. And what is God saying? We can't just seek any vengeance that we want. Vengeance is the Lord's. So we have to go through the courts, or we've got to go through whatever we've got to make sure that the vengeance does not exceed what was done to me to begin with. So when he says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, what's he saying? All right, suppose he stuck out your eye. The worst you can do to him is take out his eye. You can't kill him over it. You blind him in one eye. He knocked a tooth out. Best you could do is knock his tooth out, not break everything in his body. You know, what happens with us a lot of times? Whenever we're mad and in that situation, we go beyond what it is. We can't control ourselves. And the eye for an eye, this lex talionis is what this law is. This lex talionis says, this is it. You cannot go beyond what was done. The punishment must fit the crime. And that's a principle he lays out that has been the law of the land in our country for many, many years. And now, again, in a lot of these situations, it gets worse. Notice verse 22, you shall have the same law for the stranger and for the one in your own country. So you see, they took the man outside the camp and stoned him with stones. They did as the Lord said. So there's the end of that story. And again, we learn that's the emphasis that he's saying. And here's that first case law here in that situation. All right, any questions, comments on that? Okay. All right. Chapter 23. All right, let me say this. Leviticus chapter 23 is a very important passage. Leviticus 16:17, where it talks about the Day of Atonement, is an important passage. And the first few chapters, when he talks about these laws, this chapter is dealing with the various feasts of the law. All righty? The feast of the Lord. All righty? He said, you shall proclaim holy convocations. These are my feasts. Holy convocations. In other words, these are holy assemblies where the children of Israel get together. And now we're going to find a list of all these different feasts. All right? The first one that he emphasizes is the Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Notice there's 5 things he says about this. Number 1, it is on the 7th day. 6 days shall work be done. The 7th day is a Sabbath. A Sabbath of what? Number 2, solemn rest. Solemn rest. Number 3, it is a holy this is a holy day. God says this is a holy day. Number 4, it is the Sabbath of the Lord. And number 5, it is applicable to everybody. You need me to go through that again? Number 1, the 7th day. Number 2, it is a day of rest. Number 3, it is a holy day. Number 4, it is the Lord's day. It is the Sabbath of the Lord. And obviously, if it's the Sabbath of the Lord, you do no work on it just as the Lord didn't. And then 5, it is applicable to everybody in all your dwellings. All right? Yes, sir.
I remember reading something about that the word for Sabbath really doesn't mean like the last day of the week. I mean, that's what it occurs. It doesn't mean that because there's another kind of Sabbath as well in Scripture. I can't remember much about that Sabbath, but there's another day that's also a Sabbath, and that's not on the last day of the week.
Yeah.
I can't, that's fuzzy. I can't recall all about that.
As we go through this, there's going to be a lot of days of rest. Okay?
The Sabbath kind of meant
a day of rest, right. So as we go through this, when we're looking at some of these various days, we're going to see that they're not only going to be resting 52 days out of the year on the Sabbath, but when they partake of certain feasts, there are certain days it's got to be as a Sabbath as well.
That's a Sabbath rest.
It's a Sabbath rest. There are certain things they can do, and there are certain things they cannot do on these days. So as we start going through these various feasts, we're going to see this, how it's not just 52 days out of the year, but before it's all over with, there's going to be close to maybe 70 or 80 days out of the year where they do nothing. Okay? As we look at all of this together. And again, part of this is going to boil down to is the idea of what's going on. And another thing that's going to come, you're going to see this idea of Sabbath here over and over and over again in this chapter. Okay? You're going to see the Feast of Weeks, which is going to be 7 weeks. All righty? Okay, brother?
I got a question.
All right.
Now, back in this time, was there Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday?
They would call them by different names, obviously.
Okay.
The first day of the week would be Sunday.
It was Sunday back then?
It would have been Sunday because Sabbath means seventh. Okay? That means seventh. So Sunday would have been, but they would have called it by a different name. Okay? But yeah, there would be 7 days per week. In a week. Okay? And the only other thing that's going to be different is, like I've shared with you before, we live with a solar calendar. They do more of their calculations with a lunar calendar. And how did I say it before? Huh?
Kind of like a sunset calendar.
Yeah, with a lunar calendar, they're going to be doing more with the moon. And so they're going to actually have to add 2 months. After a long period of time, they're going to have to add a month to get everything caught back up to everything. Remember that? So just keep that in mind as you're looking at this. This chapter does emphasize a great deal about this idea of the seventh. All righty? So the first thing, okay, go ahead.
It actually means the seventh.
Huh? It means the seventh, but it also would suggest the day of rest. So there will be other Sabbaths, and that word would be used to talk about a day of rest, but it won't be on the seventh day, because it depends on how these feasts would fall in their calendar in that lunar cycle. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, we know that Easter, a lot of years, sometimes is in March and sometimes it's in April. And we're asking ourselves why. Well, it's because it's tied in. They count Easter as tied in with the Passover because that's when Jesus was crucified, during the Passover. So that's the reason why that date's going to change every year. Okay? But we would still celebrate Easter on that Sunday. Okay, you know what I'm trying to say? We're trying to celebrate, the world celebrates that Easter on that Sunday that it tied in with the Passover. Okay? But there will be other days of rest through these things. And a lot of times they will not be on a Sabbath day, but it will still be called a Sabbath rest. All right? Does that help? Or is that getting even more confused?
And the days weren't always like 12 hours a day and 12 hours a night. It's kind of like from sunset, so long after sunset or before sunset to sunset.
As it figured out, and they go back to Genesis 1.
Changes.
Yeah. The evening and the morning were the first day. So that's how he started it off in Genesis chapter 1. So they would always count their days, not in midnight, but at probably about 6 o'clock in the afternoon. So when Jesus died upon the cross, he died Friday evening. They had to rush to bury him. He was in the tomb on the Sabbath day. And he got up. He was resurrected early that Sunday morning. Okay? So,
On the third day, 3 days had passed.
not the way we count it. But you see, we do the same thing. We sometimes count part of a day as a day, right? They did that all the time. Any part of a day would be the day. But if you're looking for an actual 3 24-hour periods, no.
When they say in the 9th hour this occurred.
So then it would be if it was the 9th hour in the evening, or excuse me, It would start at 6 o'clock. So the 9th hour, you would add 9 and 6. That would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. See? Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay. All righty.
Sorry to get way off.
Not a problem, brother. We're doing fine. We're doing fine. All righty. The first two feasts he mentions are the Passover and unleavened bread. The Passover is mentioned 26 times in the New Testament. And of course, what does the Passover remind them of? Leaving Egypt, Exodus chapter 12. All righty. These are the priests, the holy convocations. The Passover will always be in the spring. All righty. It will always be in the spring. So on the first day of the first month at twilight, notice the word twilight is the Lord's Passover. Twilight would be what? The evening, right? So again, that's how they count their days. And again, it goes back to Genesis chapter 1. So the Lord's Passover would be between 2 evenings. On the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord. So a lot of people get these kind of confused, but they're actually two separate feasts that's going on. There's the Passover, and then the very next day would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, we understand, and this Feast of Unleavened Bread would be a 7-day feast. So, when they pass over, when Jesus was dying or about to die on the cross, they had to eat unleavened bread because, again, it commemorated the Passover, that they did not have time for their bread to rise. The Feast of Unleavened Bread would follow right on the heels of that, literally, and this would be a 7-day feast celebrating their deliverance from Egypt. And so a lot of times, as you're reading through the scriptures, sometimes it may say Passover, but it may have reference in the context to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it lasting longer than just that day. So sometimes that gets a little bit confusing. Huh?
Sometimes people say they're synonymous. Actually, they're not.
They're not. They're not synonymous. But he might say, I can't remember one place right off the top of my head, but during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, we know automatically now that it's sometime in spring, it's right after the Passover, and it was sometimes during that time frame, right after the Passover, where they're partaking of this bread. Okay? And he said, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. So you have the Passover on a day when you're not supposed to, you would eat the day before that twilight, you would partake of the Passover meal. Then you would not work on the Passover. And then when the next day came, you would not work on that day either. All right? So here you have 2 days where you don't work. That is another day. You shall do no customary work. Now, what do we mean by customary work? Well, the ladies would continue, you think about it in this respect. We think about work, customary work. What does he mean by that? It's working in an occupation. If you're a farmer, you don't go out and work the fields that day. Okay? Now there's some things you have to do. You have to have, the ladies probably would be preparing a meal of unleavened bread. And that's customary work, yes, but in another sense, it's a different work in the fact that what? You're celebrating here in this particular circumstance. All right? And he says, you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So now you have, this day would be a day they didn't work. The beginning of the feast and the end of the feast is another day they wouldn't work. So now you have, in essence, 3 Sabbaths right there together. See, 3 rest days right there together. Sometimes these would fall on a Sabbath day. A lot of times they wouldn't. Look at our calendars. Look at where last year, the 24th was on a Wednesday. And the year before that, it was on a Tuesday. Right?
Yeah, there you go.
So that's the idea I'm trying. So every year it's going to be on a different date. And every year, it might, about every 7 years, it will fall on a Sabbath somewhere down the line. But otherwise, whatever day it was, you didn't work. And again, it was a day to remember. Isn't it interesting
Somebody had to work hard to keep all this straight back then.
Well, that's the reason why God wrote it down. And everybody by the time, it's like anything else. When you get used to doing something, it's just like, oh, yeah, okay, Passover's coming up. We've got to get this ready. We've got to get this ready. We've got to make sure this is going on. We got to make sure there's no leaven in the house. In my Exodus class, I tried to show a film where supposedly right before the Passover, the Jewish rabbi would go into a Jewish person's house and examine the house and see if they found any leaven in it whatsoever. He's paid to do that. So they would clean the house out of every bit of leaven. And they still do that today, by the way, to declare the house clean to where they could partake of the Passover in the way that God commands. Okay?
What is leaven exactly?
Well, again, it would be something like yeast. And we're going to come across this. We have looked at, up to this point in time, a lot of these sacrifices that God has demanded that they offer could not have leaven in it until tonight. And we're going to see the Feast of Weeks, where God does want a sacrifice with leavened bread. And now we get into the question, why that time and not any other time? And the answer is, I don't have a clue. Okay, if somebody wants to study on that one a little bit, go ahead. We'll look at this in just a few moments. But the only time leaven was allowed to be offered to God was during the Feast of Weeks. That's the only time that leaven was to be offered. All right. If you're looking in the New King James Version, in my Bible, it then says the Feast of First Fruits. There's a lot of debate among commentators if this was a feast or not. Now, because we see the words Feast of First Fruits, but you got to remember that this was added by the people who translated the Bible. All righty? So this may not be a feast, because you'll notice in every one of these feasts that he mentions, he talks about a holy convocation, but this one he doesn't mention. And it may very well possibly be that he's saying here this Feast of First Fruits would also be around March and April, when the first fruits of the ground would be coming up. All righty? The very beginning of this, as you're looking at this, he does not mention the word holy convocation. And so there are some people that think that this, what is called the Feast of First Fruits, may very well be tied in, again, with Passover and unleavened bread. It just may be a part of this unleavened bread celebration. Okay? And then you actually have those that say, no, this is a whole other feast. All right, so I'm just trying to give that idea to you as you're looking at this. This would be about the time of the first fruit of their harvest. And the first harvest that they would have would be barley. They would be harvesting barley. Barley ripens before wheat does. So this would be the first fruit. Again, they shall bring a sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest to the priest. So when they start going out there harvesting this stuff, they would tie these into these bundles, and the first sheaf would go to God. And again, it would be used for that, and this sheaf would be waved before the Lord. Now, we talked about before what a wave offering was. What was that? It was brought up, it was lifted up as an offering to God, and it was waved before God. So everybody would know this is God's part. All righty? So yeah. So he would offer that sheaf on that day. When you wave the sheaf, a male lamb of the first year without blemish as a burnt offering to the Lord. Its grain offering shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil. We've seen that before. Huh? Yep. And so he said, you shall eat neither bread nor parched grain nor fresh grain until the same day that you brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever. So in other words, you would eat this before you started eating your harvest, your crops. You would bring the first part of it to God. You're giving God the first fruits. And that's why it's called the first fruits. All righty? Think about this. They're offering this to God. Now, if you want to jot this down, this is maybe something to encourage you a little bit, but I was talking about a few minutes ago about what days off they would have. According to chapter 23, verse 3, they would be off on the Sabbath day. Chapter 23, verse 7, they would be on the feast of the Passover and unleavened bread. Chapter 23, verse 8, again, the seventh day after that would be a holy convocation to the Lord. Chapter 23, verse 21, you shall proclaim on that same day a holy convocation. This is the Feast of Weeks. We'll talk about that in a moment. Chapter 23, verse 25, you shall do no customary work on the Feast of the Trumpets. Chapter 23, verse 28, you shall afflict your souls, and you shall do no work on the Day of Atonement. Chapter 23, verse 30 and 31, he continues to talk about that idea of the atonement. This goes back to what you were talking about earlier, Carrie. Verse 32 emphasizes, it shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest. You shall afflict your souls. Chapter 23, verse 35, you shall do no customary work on the Feast of the Tabernacles. Verse 36, and again, verse 39. How many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times in this passage, he emphasizes the days they are not to work. The Sabbath, and then 10 other days on top of that. So 52 plus 10 is what? 62 weeks or 62 days out of the year, no work should be done. Because this is to God. You're not working because this is what God wants. You're worshiping God. All righty, let's stop there for about 5 minutes, come back. All right, it's about 7:30, so let's give it about 5 minutes. 5 minutes, 5 minutes. I'll ring a bell. Everybody needs to stand up and move, don't they?
Yeah.
Amen.
Sure.
Amen. I like to preach because I can move.
Well, when we were having our services online,
Mm-hmm.
when the preacher was used to moving, he'd move off camera a lot.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, and there we go. We're recording again. So now we're on the Feast of First Fruits. And again, there's some question whether or not this is really a feast or separate feast, or is it attached to the ideal of the Passover and unleavened bread? We're not going to say one way for sure, one way or the other, but that's the idea that we need to think about. All right, the Feast of Weeks. What is that known as? 7 weeks plus 1 day is equal to 50 days, which would be what we know as Pentecost. Okay? The Feast of Weeks is also known as Pentecost. All righty? So, you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. This is verse 14. From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. Now, by this time, as I said earlier, according to what I was reading, the first fruits would be the barley. Now, by this time, you're having wheat. All righty? And so, this would be the only feast. I don't know about that. Let me not make that statement until I make triple sure about that. Okay. All right. So you count 50 days. You bring from your dwelling 2 wave loaves of 2/10 of an ephah. These shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. So again, here's the first fruits of the Lord. And this is the only feast wherein leaven would be used. The only time leaven would be allowed. You shall offer with the bread 7 lambs the first year, without blemish, 1 young bull, 2 rams. They shall be as a burnt offering, and their grain offering, and their drink offering. You shall sacrifice 1 kid of the goats as a sin offering, 2 male lambs of the first year of the sacrifice of a peace offering. The priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits as a wave offering before the Lord. Now notice here he's tying verse 20 in with the idea of reaping the harvest of the first fruits. So here you have the first fruits of what? the first fruits, not of barley, but of wheat. So you're giving them, and you shall proclaim on the same day that it is a holy convocation to you. You shall do no customary work on it. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generation. And when you reap the harvest of the land, this goes back to Leviticus chapter 19, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you weep, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the stranger. I am the Lord. And we talked about earlier about how they were to be watching out for one another. And Ruth is the background of that idea. Okay? So the Feast of Weeks will also be known as the Pentecost. Jesus died on Passover. The Feast of Weeks would be 50 days later. So Acts 2 verse 1 opens up when the day of Pentecost, what? Had fully come. What happens on the day of Pentecost? The preaching of the gospel for the very first time and the beginning of the church. Okay, so this is the Feast of Weeks, and this is where all this is playing in. All righty? Now, as I said earlier, you're going to see a lot of sevens here. All righty? As we start the Feast of Trumpets, there's going to be 3 different things going on in the 7th month. In the 7th month, there's 3 things. There's going to be the Feast of the Trumpets. There's going to be the Day of Atonement. And then there's going to be the Feast of the Tabernacles. Okay? So all of these are going on in the 7th month. So it's interesting, you see this phrase 7th again. The Sabbath day was on the 7th. The Passover was on the 14th day. 2-1. All righty? The Feast of Weeks, 7 weeks plus a day. In the 7th month, there's 3 festivals. Then you're going to see a little bit later on, as we go for one more thing, he's going to talk about Jubilee leap year. Now, what is Jubilee? The forgiveness of debts, and that's going to be what? 49 years. That's 7 times 7 plus 1. Jubilee is 50. So, and we're going to talk about what's going on there in that respect, but it's 7 times 7 plus 1. So 7, it becomes a very important number, and that may very well be part of the reason why we attach so much significance to 7 today, right? 7 days of the week. If you were living into the Jewish economy, so many things were going on in the 7th month. You have the Feast of Pentecost, 7 days plus, or 7 weeks plus 1 day. So all of these things come into play here. What is the Feast of Trumpets? Beginning in verse 23. Now, as I said, you have the Feast of Passover and Unleavened Bread, and possibly the Feast of First Fruits tied in with it, but then you have the Feast of Weeks, and then you're going to have the 7th month. So again, the first fruits in these situations. Now you're talking about the 7th month of the year. So this would be possibly September, October. Okay?
Now, that'll get me a little confused.
Okay. All righty. All right. Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It'll be October now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or then.
Yeah. Yeah. So March and April would be the first 2, the Passover and the unleavened bread. Then the Feast of the Weeks would be 50 days after that. And then 7 weeks, or a little bit, the 7th month would be September or October. Okay. So now we're talking about something different. And so again, you have all these feasts going on roughly at the same time. In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest again. Now, I want you to notice, if you're reading from the King James Version, that word rest is what? It's added, it's italicized. So you shall have a Sabbath. So again, there's that idea. It's a memorial of blowing of the trumpets. You shall do no customary work on it. You shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. So, and a lot of times this word Shabbat, simply means a day of rest. Okay? All right, the 7th month on the first day of the month. Now notice it's not the 7th day of the month. It's the 7th day. It's the first day of the 7th month. You have a Shabbat. Okay? So does that help you a little bit in that respect? And the fact that sometimes this word Shabbat means just simply a day of rest. This is not the 7th day. This was the first day of the 7th month. Now, It could have been, thinking about it from the first day of the seventh month, it could have been on a Shabbat, seventh day of a week, right? Because again, our months, what? They don't always start the same day. You know, January 1st may start on Sunday, but that don't mean February 1st is going to start on Sunday, right? So that's something else you've got to take consideration there. But again, you still have this Shabbat there. Then you have on the 10th day of the seventh month is the Day of Atonement. And we've already talked about that back in Leviticus chapter 16 and 17. It's a day for you to afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. No work on that day, for it is the Day of Atonement to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. Any person who's not afflicted on that same day shall be cut off from his people. It's a day for them to think about their sins and how their sins have separated them from God. Each Sunday.
It's not the same as forgiveness.
No, it's just for them to afflict their souls, to make that atonement. You remember we talked about that in a lot of detail in Leviticus chapter 16, where this was the only time when the blood of the bull and the blood of the sheep would actually be sprinkled on the mercy seat. That's in the most holy place. So this was a time for them to think about, again, the blood that had to be shed for the forgiveness of their sins. All righty? Let's see. Yes. Any person who's not afflicted shall be cut off. So it's a day for us to think about. It was a day for them to think about their sins. And it's a day we should be thinking about sins and how it gets in our way of God constantly, right? And doing that confession. He said, any person who does any work on that day, I will destroy. That person I will destroy from among his people. No manner of work. It shall be a statute throughout your generations and all your dwellings. It shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest, a Shabbat of rest. And you shall afflict your soul. Now, again, the word afflict comes from the idea you shall humble yourself. You shall humble yourself. That's another word there that could be there. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Shabbat. Now, notice, a Shabbat of Sabbath rest is you shall afflict on the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, you shall celebrate your Shabbat. And then, in the Feast of the Tabernacles, in the 15th day of the month, the first day of the month is Feast of Trumpets, the 10th day of the month is the Day of Atonement, the 15th day of the 7th month is the Feast of the Tabernacles. On that day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It is a sacred assembly, no customary work. Now notice, he emphasizes in the New King James, no customary work. There's some things you've still got to do, but it's not like you're going out in the fields and do all this other stuff. This is a day where you're taking off, you're thinking about God. All right? Part of the Feast of the Tabernacles would be, and well, let's go on down here. This is an offering by fire, besides the Sabbath of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides your vows, besides all your free will for offerings. On the 15th day of the month, you shall gather, when you've gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day and on the 8th day, a Sabbath rest. Okay? And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm leaves, the boughs of leafy trees, and the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. And you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year, and celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All who are native Israel shall dwell in the booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths. This was a time of celebration. They would make booths. They would make little huts to live in for 7 days, to remind them of how they had to live in the tents all during the wilderness wandering.
This was a question I was going to have about chronology here. When we're into a lot of this, they've already got fields and they got harvest, and they're going times when they let the field not be harvested. It sure sounds like you're way past the time in the wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, when we were talking about the sacrifices, those began when they were still had the tabernacle and they were.
Right. Right.
Is this happening still in the tabernacle mode, or is this?
Yeah, it's still going to be happening in the tabernacle mode. Yeah.
So I'm envisioning them on a march in this thing, and suddenly in the middle of this long march, they had time to sit and let a whole crop grow from nothing to something, so they would have something to harvest to do these feasts and to raise these animals, to do all of this. It's like that march really stalled for like long enough to grow all these crops and raise all these animals.
I don't know in this situation during the journey that they waited for the crops to grow. I think this may have been giving them the law when they actually entered the land. And again, remember, you're looking at the idea, as we look here, that God is leading them from here to the land of Canaan. And for all practical, of course, God knew about it beforehand, but for all practical purposes, he sees them in the land within a year until they commit the sin, and that whole generation has to die in the wilderness. So in essence, he's going to take care of them for this next 40 years. There's not going to be these crops where they got to wait to grow and everything, but when they actually get into the land. And hasn't he been emphasizing this all through this? When your crops, when you shall do all this, it suggests he's looking for the day when they're actually in the land. Now, did he work it out to where they could offer these things during the 40 years? God's God. He can do whatever he wants to, right? So I don't envision them actually having to wait for a crop to grow. He would give them what they would need to have this. How? Bible doesn't say. I don't have a clue.
I'm trying to reprogram. I'm thinking they were on a constant march. I knew you had to stop a day. It took a while just to set up the tabernacle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So they were just brief pauses.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I need to rethink all this, because how can you be having crops and growing them and making sacrifices out of it? It takes time. That's not like just time to set up the tent or not for a few days and move on.
Yeah.
That's a settlement.
Right.
Also, as I understand it, they moved for a while, and then they set up camp.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it tells us how long they stayed in a camp.
No.
They moved on.
No. And that's part of the issues too, is because we do know and we're going to see it, like I said, Numbers 13 and 14, if we get into the book of Numbers, we don't know how long they stayed at each one of these places. And that's some of the struggles we have with this. We try to envision it, like Carrie's saying, like I've been trying to get us to envision these things as much as I possibly can, so that we can kind of get that idea. But there's some of this that just doesn't work out in my mind like it needs to. How long would it take for them to set up a tabernacle? How long would it take for them to start the burnt offerings again? Suppose they stayed at camp for maybe 3 days, then packed back up and had to go again. How did all that work? I don't know the logistics. Some logistic officer in the military maybe could help us figure that one out. But I can't envision that in my mind, how exactly it would work out. But as I said, I'm also believing that what we're reading here in Leviticus chapter 23 is not so much on the move as much as when you are in the land, this is how this is going to work.
So he's foretelling, so to speak.
He's foretelling what's going to happen in the land. But again, God knew that they were going to be the 40-year wandering in the wilderness, but he's still telling them what they had to do. And this is once they did settle in the land, this is what they obviously had to continue to do.
Now, it's either foretelling or else these laws make this great. Or is it something that says,
Tommy?
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe we forget that God could create all of the grain needed for these people or cattle, and maybe that's how it happened until they got there.
I'm thinking, while they're on the move, he would give them whatever they would need for these feasts.
But they had fields to glean.
Right.
They actually grew something because they said,
Right.
don't glean the whole field.
Mm-hmm.
If you leave a bundle behind for the poor,
Right.
leave it behind for the poor. Don't go pick it up. So it wasn't like they just had a big basket of grain that they carried with them.
Right.
Kept bringing it to the feast.
Right.
I just can't get my mind around all.
Well, the only way I could get my mind around it is, again, he's foretelling of what's going to happen in their whenever they actually get into the land. And that's the only way it could make sense. But then, like I said, we're going to see a 40-year span when that's not happening because of their sin. And so that's a key thing to think about. All righty? Sorry, I can't give you all the answers on all of that. And was he able to do that? He can do what he wants to.
Yeah.
Right? Always remember that. He can do what he wants to. All right? So, in chapter 23, he deals with the various feasts. So keep that in mind. I want you to remember that because that's going to be a very important thing on a test later. Hint, hint, hint. Okay? Hint, hint. Hint, 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 hint. Okay. I gave you the hints. All right. Now, again, here's what's happening now as we go through this. You start seeing these things pop in here where it's not like God is inspiring Moses to write this. So I want to emphasize it's not just scattered. God has a reason to put them in these different spots. But here now, all of a sudden, he starts talking about, command the children of Israel, they bring you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, that the lamps may burn continually. As we've read through Exodus and Leviticus, we've not seen anything about burning the lamps continually, have we? And all of a sudden, he adds this in there. So you see, he's continuing to emphasize this. Outside the veil of the testimony, and again, the veil of the testimony would be what? Remember, I told you earlier, here's the Ark of the Covenant in here. I'm not even going east, west, north, or south, okay? Okay. And here would be the altar of incense. This veil of the testimony is this separated the holy place from the most holy place. Okay? So, again, outside of the veil of the tabernacle and the tabernacle of meeting, Aaron shall be in charge of it from evening to morning and before the Lord continually. It shall be a statute forever. He shall be in charge of the lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord continually. A lot of times whenever you're seeing this lampstand, it's the ideal of this. We see it like this, don't we? We wish we could if I had a good marker.
There is one. I put new markers up there. So
Okay, brother,
new
thank
and
you.
old book.
Okay, I just got to find the right one.
Yeah.
Thank you, brother. So the lampstand would have looked something like this, only it would have been gold, not blue. All right? Something like this. This is what most folks think it looks like. It would have 7 lamps. So you would have to have this anointing or this oil in all these lamps, and that oil would have to be changed. This lamp would have to burn continually. So Aaron, being so close to where it was, Aaron or the priest would make sure that these wicks are trimmed and it's burning continually all the time before this. And so there's some debate. Was there 7 of them? Again, they would have looked like little bowls with a wick sticking out of it. This would have been a bowl, and that would have been the opening, and they had oil poured in them. So he gets specific about this particular tabernacle lamp. And again, he shall be in charge of the lamps on the pure gold lampstand before the Lord continually. Then he talks about the bread of the tabernacle. Now, remember earlier, the bread of the tabernacle would be on the what? The table of showbread, right? All right. Now, there's some big questions here, too, depending on who you read. Take fine flour, bake 12 cakes on it, 2/10 of an ephah. You shall set them in 2 rows, 6 in a row on the pure gold table. You shall put pure frankincense. It shall be a bread for a memorial, an offering made by fire to the Lord. Every Sabbath it shall set in an order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons. They shall eat it in a holy place. It is most holy to him from the offerings of the Lord made by fire by perpetual statute. Well, we do know of one occasion where somebody besides the priest ate it. Who was it? David. Okay. And again, we don't know exactly how big those cakes would have been. So we just picture in our mind exactly what's going on, what's happening there. We've already covered chapter 24, verse 10 through 23 with the death of the man for blasphemy. And again, we're going to read in Numbers chapter 15, another situation. Now the Sabbath of the seventh year. Speak to the children. I'm in chapter 25, verse 1 now. Everybody there? All righty. Chapter 25, verse 1. He spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. So now we still know he's still there at Mount Sinai. When you come into the land I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. Now here not only do we have a Shabbat for the people, but also a Shabbat of the land. And I've shared with you before that land needs to rest every once in a while because nutrients need to be built back in it. So 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the seventh year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for your land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow nor your field nor prune your vineyards. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. It is a year of rest for the land. Now, we get kind of confused about that. When you're reading this, it kind of just sounds like they're not supposed to pick anything and eat anything. So what are they going to do for that year? How are they going to eat that year? But I think what he's trying to emphasize here is the idea of being a farmer. Whenever you're sowing seed, you're going to try to sell the food. In this situation, you don't sell it. You're what? You're just eating it. That's all. So every 7 years, they weren't even supposed to plow the ground. Okay? They were not supposed to plow the ground. They were not supposed to farm. Think about, for a few moments, think about the implications of this. You would have to trust God to give you enough in the 6th year to make it for the whole next year. That's a lot of trust, right? You would have to trust God enough to do that. Not only that, but you would have to trust God enough to where if you can't sow the seed, you would have to find some way to sow that seed to where when you could sow again, that you would have it a year later and be able to sow the seed of the field again. Why does God give these commands? It's trust. Do you trust me to take care of you? How often, trying to put it in my feeble mind for a few moments, you know, if I was sitting there working as a farmer and I was told, well, next year you can't plant, and you all you can do is just reap whatever grows for yourself. You can't do nothing. You got to let the land rest. That's going to take some faith, brother.
I remember reading about that pastor when you were saying something about letting the land lie fallow for 7 years. How would that work? You know, I mean, I read it before the Bible.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand how it was told.
You would have to let it lay fallow for 1 year, but it would be every 7 years. Okay? And again, all I can tell you is it would take a lot of trust in God. And God, through all of these laws, what is he trying to get his people to do? Trust me. I'm going to take care of you. What about us as Christians? Well, we work ourselves to death because we think, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. You know, God is still working, folks. He's still in charge. He's still going to do what needs to be done. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you didn't know where you were going to get the next meal, and the next thing you know, it's there? God is still working. And that's something that I think is very important for us to really consider and to meditate on. Now, I want you also to look at the fact that in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, he ties the 70-year captivity in Babylon. 70 again. There's 7. 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. The 70-year captivity in Babylon with their failure to obey God in this 7 years. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And it's interesting, and most people do not know this, and I think I've shared this with you before, but I'll remind you again. If you're actually reading the Hebrew Bible, if you were a Jew and you're reading the Hebrew Bible ends with 2 Chronicles. Okay? This also helps us to explain Jesus and what he said earlier. But notice 2 Chronicles 36:15. The Lord God of their fathers sent warning to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them because he had compassion on his people. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, till there was no remedy. Boy, there's a sermon. Till there's no remedy. There's nothing more that can be done. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin. In the age of the weak, he gave them all into his hand. And all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and the leaders, all these he took to Babylon. He burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces, destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. Isn't it interesting that God's people once again become enslaved? Why? Because of their own sins, because of their own mistakes. Now listen, to fulfill the word by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So the 70 years that they did nothing was the 70 years when they were in Babylonian captivity was because the land could fulfill her Sabbath. So obviously they did not listen to what God said about the 7th year, and they continued to carry on business like usual, and they finally had to pay for it. 50 years or 70 years in Babylon. So it's interesting as you're reading this and you see the Sabbath of the 7th year, how again it's there to emphasize this. All righty. Chapter 25, verse 8, the year of Jubilee.
Well, do you think today, if you were in Israel, you would still see crops sitting fallow for?
No, I know that wouldn't happen, And again, that was under the Old Testament law. Does God command that? You see, he commanded it to them. He's holding them accountable, but what? It's not applicable today. So no, in all probability, no. Okay?
If it was, everybody would be talking about it and hearing about it.
That's right. That's right. The year of Jubilee. All right? You shall count 7 Sabbaths of years. So 7 times 7 is what? 49. And the time of the 7th Sabbath shall be 49 years, and they shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. And on the day of atonement, you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all of its inhabitants. You shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. I shared with you before the idea that I have, and I still believe, that the Jubilee year, and this is where we read about it, this is going to be every 50 years. This was a reset of their economy. Okay? So here's how it's all going to work out. Let's kind of look at it in a little bit of detail. You shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes of the untended vine. Now, let's stop for a moment. You remember it was 49 years. Every 7 years they had to do what? Every 7 years they were not to plow or do anything, remember? We just got finished looking at this. Now you come to the Jubilee year. So it's not just, you have the 7th year, 7 times 7. So the 7th year would be the 49th year, and another year you don't plow or anything. You're looking at 2 years in a row now where you don't do anything. You let the ground stay fallow. Because again, he says that year as well, he says, you shall neither sow nor reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine. It is the Jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its produce from the field. In other words, God's going to give you enough to eat, but you're not going to do it to sell. Now, another thing that happens, you shall return to your possession. If you sell anything to your neighbor, or you buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. So according to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor, and according to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. According to the multitude of years, you shall increase its price, and according to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price. Let me try to read this to you here. Maybe this will make a little bit more sense. If again, you're reading the commentary along with this in Coy Roper's, let's talk, let me see here. Yeah. All right. You had to sell your land because you owed somebody something. So you sold it. This guy bought the land. Now, that means you can't what? You can't plow or do nothing like that. That guy has got your land and you're trying to pay off a debt or anything like that. Now you finally get to the point where you pay off that debt, now you've got to work on trying to get your land back. And here's how it would work out. If he sold himself or the land in the 20th year of the 50-year cycle, this is on page 519 of this commentary. Okay, so you look it up yourself. If you sold himself as a slave, maybe, and again, they would do that, in the 20th year of the 50-year cycle for $3,000. And he's redeemed in the 30th year of the cycle, the price of his redemption would be $2,000. Everybody has this quizzical look like, huh? I can't work the math out too well either. All right. The 20th year of the 50-year cycle. So you got what? 50-year total. But he sold it in the 20th year. 20th year of 50-year cycle. So how many years is left? 30, right? 30 years left. So he sold it for $3,000. That's our way of thinking. Obviously, they didn't have dollars back then, but you know what I'm trying to say. Now, he was redeemed in the 30th year of the cycle. So what's happened? 30 minus 20, that's 10 years. So it's been 10 years in the 30th year of the cycle. So 10 years, 30th year of the cycle.
Change pins there.
Huh? I'm sorry.
Just throw that one away and take a different marker, a fresher.
Oh, that's what you're talking about. Thank you, brother. Yes.
There you go.
Yes. Anyway. All right. So he redeems it in the 30th year.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So how many years difference is that? It's 10. All right. So if you take out, he paid it. Okay. It works out to be $2,000. He owes $2,000 to get that property back. Okay, why? I'm still working on the math. X minus Y plus Z equals X squared. No, all right. This is how it roughly works out. He gets $2,000. In other words, he would have to pay $2,000 to get his land back after the 10 years. Okay. All right, that's how it would work out. He pay instead of $3,000, he would have to pay $2,000 because why? This guy is getting the profit off his land for that 10-year time frame. So all he would have to pay back is the $2,000 instead of $3,000 of it. All righty. Now, the thing is, who paid the redemption price? He would pay the owner of the Israelite slave that he had paid for him minus the value of the work of the 10 years he had owed him. So again, if the guy sells himself along with the land, what else has happened? He's selling himself to this guy So he not only has the land values, but he also has what? He's had 10 years of work. So 10 years of work, $1,000. And now if he can scrape up $2,000, he can buy the land back. He can redeem the land. He can buy the land back. That's what the word redemption means, to buy back. So that's how that plays out in that respect. And a lot of times, a lot of these people would have to sell themselves to be slaves to do that. Bad financial decisions, you know. And you lose property. You lose what else? Profit. You lose not only that, but above everything else, you're losing rights to the land. Now, suppose he waited till the end of the 50 years. All right, he sold it at year 20. He lives another 30 years. At the end of 50 years, what does he owe? Nothing. He gets his land back, and what? He doesn't owe anything. The sad tragedy of it is, if he sold himself when he was 20 years old and he lived 50 years, he's now 70 years old. But here's the thing. He can give his land now to his descendants. And hopefully they can do and make better decisions than he did. And so you see, that's how this whole thing really starts playing out with regards to the year of Jubilee. It was, you might say in a sense, as one person put it, it's a lease as opposed to buying it. It's a lease. You give me this amount of money, that way I'll lease the land to you. I have some friends of mine that live in Alabama and that recently bought 40 acres of land. And my friends, they don't know anything about being farmers or anything like that, but they got 40 acres of land. And so what do? Well, the guy that was living next to him had been leasing the property for a long time so that he could feed his cattle on it. He would feed cows on it. He would cut hay off the land. And in essence, what they're doing is he's leasing the land. He's paying the owners of the land the money. And this is extremely interesting in this whole thing. This guy that's leasing the land is actually making my friend's house payment and the 40-year payments on the property. Because the lease is that valuable to him, because he has to have land to feed his cattle. And so you see, it works out for everybody. So that's the best. That's another way that maybe can help you to understand it a little bit more. So here's how it's happening in that situation. Notice as he's talking about this, all of this happens the 50th year. You shall neither reap nor sow. Again, you got 2 years in a row where they could do that. The year of Jubilee is holy. You shall eat the produce from the field. You shall not oppress one another. And then he goes on to the provisions for the 7th year. You shall fear the Lord your God. Here's the reason why. Verse 23. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. God said, this is my land. I'm letting you use it. You're not going to sell it permanently. And so he is making things. He says, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. That's it. Now, notice the provisions for the 2nd year, beginning verse 18. You shall observe my statutes, keep my judgments, perform them, and you will dwell in the land of safety. There's a great motive for obedience. You do what I tell you to do, I'll take care of you. I'll make sure that you're eating. I'll make sure that you get what you need. But it, again, boils down to a matter of faith and trust. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow or gather? I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. So the 6th year, the 7th year, and then enough for what? You to sow the land again in the 8th year. God says, I'm going to bless you so much that 6th year, you're going to have 3 years worth of food and everything you're going to need. God was taking care of his people. Why? Again, this is my land. You are my people. I'm taking care of you. And so, if one of your brothers become poor and has sold something of his possession, and if a redeeming relative comes to redeem it, he may redeem what his brother sold. If the man has no one to redeem it, but he becomes able to redeem it, let him count the years since its sale and restore the remainder to the man to whom he sold it, he may return to his possession. But if he's not able to have it restored to himself, what is sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee. And then what happens? 50th year, you get the land back. If a man sells a house in a walled city, he may redeem it a whole year after it's sold, within a full year. But if it's not redeemed after the year, then the house in the city shall belong permanently to the person who bought it. How many of us would go into deals like that? I'm going to buy this house. It's in a city, but, and the guy says, well, I want the right of redemption. And you're sitting there thinking, oh, okay. No, I want the house. How many of us is going to buy a house for a year and then have to turn it back in? Not many. So you see, the only way this could really work out is if he knew the guy well enough to know he's not going to be able to redeem it. But that's within a walled city. If it's outside the city, if it's ground, then what? He can, it can be redeemed in 50 years. In other words, that he says the cities of the Levites, Levites may redeem at any time. If a man purchases a house from the Levites, then that house was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the Jubilee. But the field of the common lands of the cities may not be sold. It is their perpetual possession. All righty? Okay, I got about 30 more minutes. And I'm going to try my best to finish Leviticus tonight, and I'll do it. Okay? Okay. If one of your brethren, verse 35, becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, you shall help him. Why do people become poor? They make bad decisions. They get taken. They're not,
They just get ill.
they become ill. They can't deal with it. There's a lot of reasons why people could become poor. I think a lot,
Some of them are, they shouldn't have gotten themselves in a situation, others they can't help it.
That's right. That's right. And here's something that emphasizes to us something that we need to think about. We don't always know why people get in the situations they do. Sometimes we do. Sometimes I jump to conclusions that maybe are not warranted. I don't know all the facts. Sometimes I become very skeptical as a preacher and an elder because people come ask for me money all the time. Three years ago, roughly, a man that was attending church with his mother came, and he's lost the house that he was living in. It was his mother's house. And I don't want to get into a long, convoluted story, but to make a long story short, we had a house next door to the building that at one time was a preacher's office, and we let him stay there. And over the period of the next 2 years, I cannot tell you how many places I have taken him to try to get a job. This is when the economy was booming and everybody and their brother was looking for help, and he could not find a job. We took him to Social Security to try to get some help. We took him to the VA. We spent for some period of time letting him go to Must Ministries so that maybe they could find him the help he needed to get a job. For 2.5 years, we paid the bill, paid the payments on, the house is ours anyway, but we're paying the heat, the air conditioning, electricity,
All utilities. All utilities.
Everything. He's not paying nothing. And it has been a big struggle in the fact that, what do? We're just to help our brothers. Where does it go from helping to enabling? Should Christians even ask that question of enabling? Did the man have some problems to where he couldn't get a job or keep a job? When you sit and listen to him and talk to him for a while, you just got to the point to where you didn't know if he couldn't function or what. How long does that go? These are struggles that elders and others deal with all the time. Now, a lot of people, when they go to a church, they are just flat out told no. And I think, again, God, because we in the church are afraid of trying to help people that we're afraid people are going to try to take advantage of us. But is that really what God wants us to do? I don't think so. I think God expects us to use the common sense that we should have. But sometimes I think we dismiss people too quickly. I can think of another situation, and I'm not going to go into any details, but of a family that I was talking with one time before. And this particular family, when she was a young girl, her dad lost a job and he couldn't find a job. This was one of those bad times whenever you couldn't find a job, no matter how hard you tried. The church didn't help them one single solitary bit. And she's always remembered that. She said, I don't believe the church can help anybody. You know, I don't believe the church is going to help anybody. This is a struggle in the fact that I would rather err on the side of helping than sit back and dismiss somebody. I do also at the same time do not want to aid or abet somebody in doing something wrong. So there's a lot that's going to be involved there. Brother, go ahead.
Hey, Tommy, I'm glad you brought this subject up because this is something that's been like a sore spot for me. Something my wife and I had talked about over the last several months. There's been a couple of times where I'd help a brother overseas in India. And I said to them at the start, I'll send what I can when I can. And then this last brother had just kept asking and asking and asking. And I said, I don't have it to send you. And he wouldn't stop. And my wife was like, is this guy even legit? I had no way of really knowing. I hate to say this, brother, but I had to cut him off because I knew him through Facebook and I blocked him and unfriended him. You know what? So I understand what you're saying. You want to err on the side of caution, but you don't want to not like help at all. So what do you do in a situation like that?
And that's part of the problem. Every situation is going to be different. And every person is going to be different. I would definitely be hesitant to help somebody maybe in India that I don't know, I don't even have some contact with. Myself personally, been getting emails from a guy in the Philippines every 3 weeks, desperately needing $300 to pay rent. But he's still able to connect to online and all that other stuff. And I'm sitting there and what I've been trying to do is to try to find out a little bit more about him, but that's in India. We're talking about here in the United States where we could try to sit down and I'm going to be honest with you here, people lie to you in a heartbeat.
Yep.
And it's a struggle. It's a real struggle. How does this come into play here? It seems like as you're looking at that, as God is talking about it here in Leviticus chapter 25, it's kind of like, lo, you give him whatever help he needs. But there does have to be some level of accountability. There has to be some level of me being convinced that I am helping as opposed to enabling. And where do you do that? Am I supposed to be a private investigator to check out all of these things in that respect?
Right.
You know, and I have met some churches that do that. People come up and they want some food or something like that, want some money. You know, we have a pantry. You want some food? I'll give you some food. Food just like that. That's what's going to happen.
Right.
All right. I had a lady call me the other day, brother. And she said, yeah, I need $200 for rent. I said, well, okay. And it just so happened the area code was not even from around Atlanta. You got 770-404-678, and now there's some more that's coming around Atlanta. There's so many area codes around here. So I started talking to her for a few minutes, and I said, well, have you asked for other churches for help? Well, yeah. I said, okay, well, what did they respond? Well, they can't help me. Okay. All righty, well, and I kept talking with her. I said, by the way, where are you living at? I don't recognize the area code. She said, she said, I'm living in Albany. I'm in Albany, Georgia. And you're calling me in Atlanta? Yeah? Why? Well, none of those churches down here help me. Wonder why that is. You know, I'm just all of a sudden now. So this is a struggle you're going to be facing if you're going to try to do the Lord's work. I always try to err on the side of helping. But you can get into situations, as I was sharing with you a few moments ago, where you're there 2 or 3 years. And there comes a point where you got to say, where do you stop? What do you do? And so that's a struggle. God doesn't put a time limit on it here, does he? He said, if your brother becomes poor, there are people out there that are going to be making bad decisions, that's going to get into poverty because of bad life choices. And he says, he becomes poor, you shall help him like a stranger that he may live with you. Well, I don't know if I'm going to take so far as to let somebody live with me either. There was one occasion whenever we did take a 16-year-old girl in. Because her mom and, again, that's a whole other thing I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but we took her in for about a year. My wife and I did. Taught her how to drive, got her driver's license, taught her how to get a job, taught her how to do some other stuff. And by the time it was over with, she and her brother and sister, who again were out on the streets, all rented an apartment together. So life worked out for them. Okay, I'm not regretting what we did. But how far? How long? You know, as you're reading it straight from here, it just seems like what, you don't take interest or usury. Think about the fact that God is watching. Err on the side of benevolence, but don't enable. And I wish I could give you some hard, fast rules on every one of them, but every situation is going to be different. Amen.
Like you say, a lot of times you're lied to.
Yeah.
You kind of change your action once you start being lied to.
Yep.
The money's not going for what you think it's going.
That's right.
And so you have to adjust as the information changes.
Right. Right.
There's a passage, something about if your neighbor asks for money, you're supposed to lend him the money.
Mm-hmm.
But if he doesn't repay, you don't go after him.
Right.
That's even further stronger than what this is. This says you just don't lend him money for excessive interest rates.
Right.
This is lending.
Yeah.
The other says you actually forgive the loan
Mm-hmm.
and make it a gift, to translate it into a gift. You know?
Right.
And you have a lot of that. People say, give me some money and I'll pay you back. And you know when you give them money, they're not going to pay you back. But that's what the scripture says.
Yeah.
Unless you find one of those situations where you know it's going for drugs or alcohol or something, you know.
And see, and again, in my situation as a preacher, I get called a lot of this. My wife won't let me carry cash because she said, you'll always give it away. and I don't, and the moment I've got cash, I've got somebody come up wanting it. I've gotten to the point to where if they need gas, I'll go buy them some gas. Okay. You know, I could do that, you know, but it is a struggle. And again, maybe we've got to see what he's emphasizing here. He's talking about one of your brethren. Again, in the church, there are those that will not help those outside the church, right? And so notice what God says about it here. We go back again to 2 Thessalonians, if any will not work, neither let him eat. But again, remember the context of that passage. A lot of the brethren were quitting work because they thought the Lord was coming at that moment in time, and that's why they quitted work. And so that's where Paul said, if any will not work, let him eat. These are people that could work but weren't because they were expecting the Lord to come and they expect the church to take care of them. And in that situation, what? If you don't work, you don't eat. See, so that's a whole different context, a whole different situation that's going on at that particular time. So we've got to take all this together, huh?
You're saying that passage doesn't apply outside of that context.
I say it first has to be applied and looked at from that context. Then you make the decisions per what you're dealing with at that moment in time. You also have Galatians 6. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, but especially unto them who are of the household of faith. you find that the church in Acts 6 was taking care of widows. That was their social safety net. It was the church taking care of them. And if it wasn't for the church taking care of them, would those widows have been taken care of? Now, we also remember that there was a controversy because the Grecian widows felt like that they were being shortchanged with regards to the Hebrew widows. And so they had to choose 7 men to be over that. 7 men. Kind of tells me how big the congregation must have been, and it also tells me what these guys' job were to make sure that these widows were taken care of. So you have the church actually taking care of the widows. Questions pop up. What if church was doing this? Would we need social safety nets like we have today, like Social Security and so forth like that? That's a whole nother question. That's a whole nother question to come into. I think, again, we become so cautious that we wind up excusing ourselves for not helping. But at the same time, we've been taken enough to be very wary of those who ask.
People who give a lot have experienced being taken a lot.
That's right.
And they keep on giving and they keep on experiencing. And you get a little wiser as you keep going along.
Keep going along.
You hear new things and you get better at it as you go along.
That's right. That's right. So, did I answer any questions here? No. I'm just saying that it's something that we really need to look at and see how God handles it. He said, listen, they're brothers. They're part of the Jewish family. You take care of them. You lend them money. Now listen, lend them money, but that necessarily means what? You expect them to pay you back, but just don't charge interest. Just don't charge interest.
Well, usury might mean, usury is considered like excessive interest.
Right.
Not
Right.
Some interest might be reasonable, but usury might be excessive.
Right. And you see, again, when you go back even with some of these sacrifices, you remember God says you offer this plus 1/5. So would that not be kind of interest on top of the actual sacrifice itself? So there's could be something to be said about that too. Anyway, I know we've discussed it, but I know we hadn't come to any conclusions. I wish I could give you an answer, but as I said, I think every situation is going to be different. Our hearts need to be where we're helping. And that's what it needs to be happening. But again, it's going to be a tough thing. And again, we've got to be careful as much as we possibly can along that line. The law concerning slavery. A brother at that time could sell himself to you. And he says, you should not compel him to serve as a slave, as a hired servant. And a sojourner he shall be with you, and shall serve you till the year of Jubilee. Then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and return to his own family. So here's a situation. Listen, Jesus always says you're always going to have the poor with you. One of the ways they would do it is they would sell you themselves, as it was, and their families to be there. He says, listen, I want to remind you something, God says. You all owe me. I bought you out of slavery, out of the land of Egypt. So you better not be mistreating any of these brothers of yours that are your servants. Because I know. That's what God is saying. You shall not rule over him with vigor, but you shall fear your God. In other words, you've always got to think about what does God want in this situation. Male or female slaves from the nations around you. From them you may buy male and female slaves. You may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you and their families, and when they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. And you shall take them as an inheritance for your children. In other words, they're going to be permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, you shall not rule over one another with rigor. If a sojourner or stranger becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, his uncle's son. Any kin can redeem him. And again, he shall reckon him who bought him. The price of the release shall be according to the number of years. The year of Jubilee, it shall be according to the time of a hired servant for him. Now here, he's saying even the stranger or the sojourner that lived among them, we're going to be under the law of the Jubilee. And at the end of the 50 years, what? He had to be released. Now, what would work out really good about that is you might be sold into slavery, and it may be only 10 more years till the year of Jubilee. That worked out pretty good for you, right? That worked out pretty good for you. But if it's the year after the last Jubilee and you sold yourself into slavery, that's not going to work out too good for you. You're going to be working for him for probably the rest of your life. Okay? So, he said, he shall be with him as a yearly hired servant. If he is not redeemed in these years, he shall be released in the year of Jubilee, he and his children. And I want you to remember, the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants. God is reminding them, listen, above everything else, I want to remind you of this. You're my servants because I bought you. Now, the same principle applies today. Jesus bought us with his blood. We're his servants. And we're always going to be his servants. So we've got to always be thinking about others besides ourselves. And so this particular lesson this evening, as we talk about it, suggests these ideas and emphasize what we need to be doing. And again, he's going to go on in chapter 27, talk about this redemption and property again. Next week, we're going to finish Leviticus. Can I hear a hallelujah? We will finish Leviticus next week and get on into the book of Numbers. I may give you one more big test on the book of Leviticus, just kind of cover everything. I'm not going to be nitpicky about little details. All right. I hope you've learned something as you've gone through this. I've learned a lot teaching it, and that's the reason why I love to teach. So we'll pick up next week, and there's something in there in chapter 26 I really want to emphasize to you that you're going to see again and again and again throughout the Old Testament. And so we'll pick up there and get on into the book of Numbers. All righty. Thank you. I appreciate all of you. Appreciate your studies. Have any questions, let me know. And again, I will try my best to get all this stuff to you this week. All righty. Thank you, brothers, sisters. All right. Have a good week.